It's all going wrong for Graham Potter. Chelsea lost this weekend to Southampton, who are bottom of the league. That is not ideal, and it has raised questions on a lot of people's minds whether or not Graham Potter is out of his depth. But before we come to answering that question, let's just have a look at how Chelsea played yesterday. So on the board in front of me, I've got Chelsea as they lined up against Southampton. They're playing a really standard 4-2-3-1. So we've got David Datro Fofana as a fairly standard 9, Joao Felix as a 10, and then we've got Madueke and Mount on either side of him. Now, you might not expect to see Mason Mount on this side. You might expect him to be more central, and he has played in central midfield as well, but he was playing out on the left. And we've got a double pivot of Kovacic and Fernandes, and they're taking turns in the build-up to drop out and help out in build-up possession. So usually Kovacic dropping between the two centre-backs so that he can help pick the ball up. He can push your full-backs a little bit higher. Sometimes Enzo Fernandez dropping out into the full-back area as well to allow the full-back to push really high up the field. These are all very basic ideas, and in possession the idea is that you spread your centre-backs, you can drop one of the players in if you need, and what Chelsea are trying to do is play the ball really direct. So you see either Mason Mount dropping in here, Joao Felix dropping in here, helping in the build-up, direct balls into them, and then trying to get in behind with a striker as well. And you've got Madueke as well, who's a little bit more of a wide player, can get the ball into these wide areas, play the ball in, overload the box, etc. Really basic 4-2-3-1 tactics, and even though Chelsea ended up losing, they did put up more expected goals than Southampton, so you could just put this one down to a little bit of unluckiness on the day. However, this is a very different way to the way that Chelsea were playing under Graham Potter when he first arrived. So let's take a look at that and think about why that change might have happened. Why might it be that Graham Potter is now setting his team up in a much more different way to the way that he has done before? So on the board in front of me here, I've got Chelsea as they lined up against RB Salzburg in the Champions League. This was Graham Potter's first game in charge, and you can see they're playing in a 3-5-2 shape. A few interesting things to notice. We've got Marc Cucurella here and Raheem Sterling playing as a situational wing back here. Now, you wouldn't usually expect to see Sterling in this sort of area on the pitch, but this is already an example of Graham Potter using players in non-standard positions, and there's going to be a lot of flexibility in the way that these structures work out. So for example, in attacking scenarios, you'll see Sterling pushing up alongside Havertz and Aubameyang in the final line. That gives space for Cucurella to move into. You can spread your two remaining centre-backs. So what you've then got is more of a back four in possession here. You've got Cucurella becoming a situational fullback here, and you can push your players forward. Now, the reason he might want a flexible structure is because he recognises that RB Salzburg are playing in a very specific structure, which he can then exploit by having his players move around in different phases of play. So he knows that RB Salzburg are going to play in a 4-4-2 diamond. I'll just throw it up on the board here. Now, the 4-4-2 diamond is very narrow, so one of the reasons you might want to get your fullbacks pushing a little bit further is because you can exploit space in these areas. So let's just start off with the back line. So when you're coming up against a strike partnership like this, you probably want to have an overload. You want to have one more player than the opposition have, and as you can see, by actually including the goalkeeper here, you can get an overload in this first line. So we've already talked about why pushing the fullbacks up might be good. It's a very narrow midfield setup, and what this is going to do is it's going to pull out these two 8s in the 4-4-2 diamond further out, and it's just going to generate a little bit more space then for these midfielders to operate as well. And then when it comes to the forward line, we've got Salzburg in a back four. There's lots of space in between each of the lines, so by having Sterling then pushing up, you can then exploit the space in between each one of those lines. So this is what we expect from a Graham Potter team. Lots of flexibility, thinking about how the opposition is structured and thinking of ways that you can actually exploit that structure. That was how he started off at Chelsea, but that is very much not how he is playing at Chelsea now. The big question is why? Now, it has been suggested that Graham Potter was flexible early on because he had so many injuries to deal with, and there's an element of truth to that. So what I've got here is each of the game weeks in the Premier League that Chelsea have had so far this season, showing you the people who've been injured player-wise at each point. So game week 9 is the important thing here. This is when Graham Potter came in, and as you can see, after game week 9, there's all of these injuries start striking up across the board. So really important injuries. So Mendy, the goalkeeper, very important. He's missing, still missing at the moment. And you've got players like Fofana, who was brought in to suit a Potter system. He goes just as Graham Potter arrives. Ben Chilwell and Reece James, really important players for him because they're able to play wing back, they're able to play full back. They're really good progressive players. And part of the reason why Chelsea have struggled, no doubt, is because Potter hasn't been able to rely on these two players. And N'Golo Kante, everyone knows about. He's super important. He's been out for most of the time, certainly been the whole time when Graham Potter's there as well. And then at the bottom here, we've got a few more important players. So Sterling, Pulisic, Armando Broja as well, quite important because he was a number 9 that was being used by Graham Potter. So it's clear that injuries have impacted Graham Potter, But actually, Graham Potter's played in this flexible style his whole career so far, so that suggests that this is just naturally the way he wants to play football. And instead, it may be the case that he has tried to play this flexible style, hasn't got the buy-in with the players, and so as a result, he's now under pressure to get results, and so he's moved to this more standard position. So that's my argument for why Graham Potter has actually shifted from this more flexible style to a more standard style. And actually, if you start looking at some of the underlying numbers, there's a sense in which that move has been successful for him. So on the board here, we've got a rolling plot of expected goals for and expected goals against. So the red line here is expected goals against. The blue line here is expected goals for. When you see blue areas, that means you're doing well. You're putting up better and more chances than your opponents. That's what you want to do. And as you can see through the whole of the last few seasons, Chelsea have largely been quite good at that, even under Frank Lampard and then Thomas Tuchel as well. We get to Graham Potter and look, you get a red area for the first time in a few seasons. This is not a good thing. So Graham Potter has definitely not been getting everything right at Chelsea so far. But actually, if we zoom in on this area and have a look at the detail, we can see that this more recent change has started turning things around a little bit for Chelsea. So this is the same area of that graph, but zoomed in a little bit more. Red line here, expected goals against, blue line here, expected goals for. And as you can see more recently, that expected goals against line is dropping down and the expected goals for line is pulling up. That is what you want a manager to do. Now, this is still not the perfect situation because in a perfect world, you'd want your expected goals for to be much higher than your expected goals against. But clearly the direction of travel is in the right trajectory here. And that shows that Graham Potter is making the right kind of moves at a tactical level to get his team back on track. And there's actually something else that's quite interesting, I think, in the underlying numbers, if we look at the expected points. So on the board in front of me, I've got a table sorted by expected points for the duration that Graham Potter has been in charge at Chelsea. Now, it's worth noting that there's different numbers of games here, so keep that in mind. We've got the underlying numbers here, and actually if we look at Chelsea during Graham Potter's time, you can see the expected goals 22.5 isn't particularly great compared to some of the other teams during that time. Very low indeed, and pretty much worse than Brentford, which is not great. So clearly there's been a problem for Chelsea generating chances. The expected goals against is more balanced. It's not quite as good as teams like Manchester City, Manchester United, but it's there and thereabouts as well. But actually what we can do is we can feed all of this information into an algorithm which does a huge amount of computation, and it throws out, based on these numbers, the sorts of points that you would expect to get from these kind of performances. And we can see here, this is the table now sorted by these teams in the Premier League. There's more teams down here that we haven't included. So Chelsea are about 7th in the table since Graham Potter came in. Not great, but also not as bad as they are on the actual table. And the reason for this is if we compare the expected points totals that we got from looking at their underlying numbers with their actual points, you can see that Chelsea are around 4 points below where you would expect them to be on the basis of their underlying numbers, which is quite unfortunate in many respects. And actually I went one step further and drilled into this expected points difference number. And what I found is that this is the figure across the whole of Graham Potter's tenure so far. That's 17 games. But if you start looking at the numbers from January the 1st onwards, Chelsea have been underperforming by around 7 expected points. So that means they're 7 points below where you would expect them to be. And that has all come in the most recent period. So what we're seeing here is Chelsea actually getting better now. What they're starting to do now is underperform according to their expected goals numbers. Another thing to remember is that Chelsea have brought in a lot of players since Graham Potter joined the club. And a lot of these players are starters as well. So we've got Mykhailo Mudryk here, Benoit Badiashile, Enzo Fernandez, Joao Felix, David Datro Fofana and Noni Madueke here as well. Now, I think there's 2 reasons why Graham Potter might have moved from a more flexible system to a more standard system. And the first one is that just simply bringing in a lot of new players is much easier to get them playing in a standard system. You won't have to overload them with tactical information, and they've probably played in a system like this before as well. The other thing is a little bit more complicated. Let's just have a think about the way that Chelsea are playing at the moment. So I've got what I think is Chelsea's best starting 11 on the board in front of me. And if you look at it, you can just see it's a team that is stacked with talent. And I think this is an explanation for why Graham Potter wants a more simple structure, because when Graham Potter was at Brighton, he was using structure to get a tactical advantage in the way that his team played. But in this team, you don't need a tactical advantage as much because you have elite players in almost every position who can solve problems on the fly. So one of the things that we've seen Chelsea doing more recently is overloading on the left-hand side, getting all of their good players around the ball, being able to possess the ball, stop the opposition from winning it, and then fashion these chances into the box for players like Joao Felix to score. Now, a really good example of that was the goal that Chelsea scored against West Ham, where Enzo Fernandez picked the ball up in the left half space, was able to fashion space for himself, play the ball to Joao Felix, who then scored. This was a goal that was scored not by tactics, but the fact that Chelsea had 2 really good players who were able to solve the problem in the moment. And so in many respects, the simple tactics that Graham Potter is using now may just be a reflection of the fact that he doesn't need to use tactical flexibility to get an upside on the football pitch. So is Graham Potter out of his depth at Chelsea? I want to suggest no. What I think has happened is that he's come to the club, tried to develop a tactical identity based around flexibility, and it hasn't really worked out. And recognising that he's got a huge amount of talent at his disposal, he's realised that actually by having a solid, basic tactic, that he can get a huge amount more upside out of his players. Now, at this point in time, Chelsea have given him a lot of time to get this right. It hasn't worked at first, it may be working now, so they'd be well within their rights to move him on. But I do think that the current trajectory is the trajectory that Graham Potter will continue in, at least for the near future. And then the big question is going to be, can a basic, solid tactic actually take you to the very highest levels and have you challenging at the top of elite football?
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.